Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review for Babel by RF Kuang. This is a standalone adult fantasy story that follows our main character of Robin. At the beginning of the story, he is a Chinese boy who has this mysterious benefactor, essentially, that takes him from his village in Canton after his entire family dies from a plague, and brings him over to London to learn and kind of assimilate to English culture, and then be a part, eventually, of Oxford. And specifically a part of Oxford called Babel, where they use various different languages and the translation of those languages for magic. And as the story goes on, Robin becomes a part of a little found family and also has to explore what it means to be a part of something that you really love while that thing is also doing damage, in this case, academia. So this is a book that I've been talking about a lot lately on various platforms. The House Salt Book Club did a live show for this, which I will link on the screen with our in-depth thoughts. We really all used that to process this book, and the ways in which this book can be kind of challenging to review and talk about, and how, for me, this book has kind of defied a rating system, but I will talk about that towards the end of this because I have more firmly solidified my ideas about this. So first, let me talk about the world building. This is largely a historical fantasy, so the fantasy elements of this are not going to be big and in your face. The fantasy elements are more used as, again, a more obvious way to point out the very real racism and colonialism within academic settings in our world. So the biggest pieces of the world building are the Oxford academic setting and then the magic system. As far as the Oxford setting, I'm hit and miss with that a little bit. It doesn't feel as immersive as I kind of was expecting it to, especially because RF Kuang herself did go to Oxford, not the Oxford of this time period, but there's a whole thing at the beginning of the book where she talks about like how she decided to sort of build this fictitious Oxford based on the real one and her experiences and things like that. So I kind of expected a little bit more immersion in that way that I don't always feel we got. This book also takes place over a lot of years, so the passage of time thing, which I'll talk a little bit more with the plot and the pacing, I feel like we didn't necessarily get to feel that immersion within Oxford and like what it felt like. There were elements though of like them loving just like the city of Oxford and things like that, and we get a lot of like lecture scenes, you know, that academia lecture type stuff, but I would have liked a little bit more of like the atmosphere that Robin fell in love with of Oxford. Next, I'm gonna talk about our characters. So first we have Robin as our main character, and then we have this little group that he becomes a part of. So there's 4 of them that all go to Babel. There's Letty, who's a white woman who comes from a more affluent family, but she feels very much marginalized due to her being a woman and like her expectations of her family, particularly her father. We have Victoire, who is a black woman, Haitian descent, I believe, and has a lot of that like Creole language is sort of what she brings to the table, along with other ones. They all kind of speak multiple languages. That's what they're sort of trained to do, and they all have very similar stories of essentially affluent white men taking them under their wing to eventually bring them to Babel and to be a piece on a chessboard for them of influence. Then we have Remy, who is arguably Robin's best friend, who is an Indian boy who, again, had a similar background. So first with Robin as our main character, and just the characters in general, I just want to have a sweeping statement about this piece for me. I don't feel like RF Kuang's characterizations are very strong in general in her books. I have read and I really enjoyed, for the most part, the Poppy War, her first series, her trilogy, and that's because I love Rin, and I think the characterization of Rin was really well done. I don't know if that's because we got 3 books with her, but I really liked her. Robin feels very much at a distance, and all of the characters really feel like at a distance. In the live show, we do discuss like, was that intentional? Is this just a weakness in writing on RF Kuang's part? I kind of feel like, now that I've read multiple books by her, that it's kind of a weakness, but maybe it's sort of intentional, especially with this, that the characters very much come off as mouthpieces for what she was to talk about, the themes and stuff. Now, characters are part of their job, if someone has a very thematic book especially, is to be a mouthpiece for certain things. So that is true inherently of a lot of characters because they are the author's creation. However, you feel at such a distance to them in this book, and there is an argument to be made that like, are they sort of representations of the colonized area that they're from? Like, again, was that intentional? For me, whether it was intentional or not, it didn't really work. So for Robin as a main character, it's not that I didn't pull for him, but I felt very like neutral. Towards the end, the book kind of picked up a bit in pacing. We got to learn a little bit more things, and I feel like maybe I pulled for him slightly more, but ultimately there were a lot of emotional beats that should have hit harder that I feel like didn't, because I didn't necessarily feel like I knew these characters and their motivations and things. As far as all the other characters, same thing for all of them, and even their dynamics were more told to us instead of shown. I think that's also something that RF Kuang struggles with a bit. I noticed it in the Poppy War as well, where we are told a lot about how characters interact and how much they love each other and how close they are, but you don't really see it. There are snippets in here, like faint, maybe, that if you extrapolate on them, I guess would be sort of some of those things, but ultimately for how much we are told by the characters and told by the narration, how close they are, how much they love each other, things like that, you really don't get to see it, and there's even points of the narration that contradict what you're being told. And I don't think that that's like an unreliable narrator way. I think that's in like the way that the characterizations and the way that she depicts relationships isn't super strong. There were a number of other smaller side characters that also I feel like we were supposed to care more about than we actually got the chance to. And there was just more characters that could have been explored and could have been really interesting if the characterization was done a little bit better. So overall, Robin is just very neutral to me. I think I'm gonna find him pretty forgettable. My favorite character of the bunch was Victoire, and especially towards the end you get some reveals about her that I really sort of wish we would have followed her. I feel like her story would have been so much more interesting and compelling in a lot of ways, and I kind of wish that we would have followed her as a character because she was probably my favorite. Next, let me talk about the plot. So along with the plot and just like the writing and stuff and the theming, the themes of this are so well done, well researched. The way that translation as a mechanism for colonialism and the way that like colonialism and racism is discussed in here is that kind of like magnum opus feeling that a lot of people have talked about with this book, of like this was a work of like love and really her pouring a lot of her academic knowledge about translation, because she is a linguist by trade, into this. That discussion was super well done. There were some moments with the way, again, this is a character thing again, where the characters do talk about racism and colonialism using very 2022 language and not like 1800s language. So that was a little bit of a miss for me, but ultimately like those discussions of how prevalent racism and colonialism is within academia and within the dark academia genre, that was all excellent. Parts about the plot and the pacing though were a little bit, again, weak for me. This is a very slow and dense book, particularly with some of the ways that we are, again, told and not shown a lot of things, and just a lot of just discussions. This read very much like a thesis or an essay instead of a fiction book, which again, I think was a choice. I'm not necessarily saying that that was something that was done out of being a mistake. I think that was a very intentional choice in a lot of ways, but it didn't necessarily really work for me. It was just very slow at some points, and then there was a lot that happened at the end in a very quick wrap up in a way that felt a little bit disjointed, and the way that some of the characters, again, personalities and characterizations changed very quickly was a little jarring. I just wish some of those plot things got seeded a little bit more. There were some really interesting twists and turns though, and ultimately this is still a good book and a well-written book. There were just some things about the style of writing that weren't necessarily for me, and things I do feel could have been done better to make it resonate more. And there were some things that again were just like style choices that weren't necessarily for me and that I feel could have been done better. Like there were definitely things that I could point out in the book, like if this was tweaked, if these characterizations were done better, that would have elevated the book for me. So this was a very hard book for me to like talk about and even rate, because the things that didn't work well for me were pretty low scoring. Like when I think about reviews and stuff, I have a spreadsheet actually that I use, and there's multiple categories, and you score sort of each category and then it averages out to be like the final rating. And I usually know what the rating's gonna be before I even do that, but it's a way to help me with some of these in-between books where like, I'm not really sure. And so doing that, the things that didn't work well were ranked low enough that it evened out the things that were done really well, like the research on the magic system and some of the plot stuff, so that it ended up sort of being like a middle of the road book for me. But that's also challenging, and why I said at the beginning that I don't necessarily feel like this works well within a traditional rating system, because I don't necessarily think it's on par with like, let's say a 3-star range book. Now my 3-star books have more good things than bad things, because I consider a middle of the road book to be a 2.5. So that's a little technicality there, that some people, you know, have their 3s be worse. So 3-star books are not bad books, but I do think what this attempted and the themes it was talking about were so well done and important that it kind of almost needs to be slightly higher. But from an enjoyment standpoint and from a craft sort of standpoint in some of these elements of books that I really care about, like characterization, I don't think it was as well done to be necessarily a 4, because a lot of my 4-star books I really enjoy, and I didn't necessarily enjoy this, but I don't necessarily think that you're supposed to enjoy this. You see all of these things sort of contradict each other. This is a very contradictory book in my head. So I've sort of landed on like 3.75, but the like quality of what it's trying to do is more 4, but then some of the, like, again, characterization and style choices are more 3. So this one is more like, I can't necessarily rate it in truth, and it's more, this is a good book that I would recommend to people still, but there were some things it didn't do very strongly for me myself. So I know that was very complicated, but comment down below and let me know what you thought of Babel. I am not going to do a spoilery discussion for this because I've already talked about it at length in various places, and I did do the whole live show. We have over an hour of discussion on the live show, so I will link that on the screen for you guys to check out our thoughts. I can't really think of anything else that we didn't talk about in the live show as far as this book. So you will get a lot more of us processing some of this, like how this book is sort of in between, and we can't necessarily like have a very firm rating for it, although we do all rate it by the end of the live. So yeah, comment below, let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.